Please like, share, and subscribe. Wishing you happiness and good luck every day.
All right, let's talk about a friendship that, and I'm not exaggerating here, literally changed the world. We're diving into the story of Warren Buffett and Bill Gates, based on Anthony McCartan's incredible book. It's about how this super unlikely bond didn't just change two lives, but completely reshaped the way we think about giving back. I mean, just think about that question for a second. What does happen when a stock picker meets a software king? You've got the most successful investor of the entire 20th century on one side, and on the other, you have the, brilliant but pretty ruthless founder of the company that was taking over the digital world. Their universes couldn't have seemed more different. And this really shows you just how far apart they were back in July of 1991. You had Warren Buffett, the Oracle of Omaha, this beloved kind of grandfatherly figure everyone loved. And then there was Bill Gates. Yeah, he was a tech genius for sure. But his reputation, he was being seen more and more as this corporate bully, a monopolist who just crushed anyone in his way. To Bill, Buffett was just a guy who moved around pieces of paper. He didn't actually build anything. And here's the kicker. The feeling was totally mutual. Neither of them even wanted to be at this meeting. Bill's mom, Mary, was basically forcing him to go. He literally told his helicopter pilot he was only staying for 2 hours, tops. And Warren, well, you can see what he was thinking. He was complaining to his friend, wondering how long they had to stick around to be polite. So, yeah, the start of this world-changing friendship was, not looking good. But then something just clicked. That 2-hour time limit? Gone. Out the window. Right away, Buffett starts drilling Gates with what Bill later called amazingly good questions about Microsoft, about the software business, questions nobody had ever thought to ask him. He wanted to know how a company like Microsoft could possibly take on a giant like IBM. And just like that, Bill, the ultimate teacher, had found his most dedicated student. So this intense conversation just keeps going all day. The two of them are basically ignoring everyone else at the party, just lost in their own world. They're talking on the beach, they're talking during a game of croquet, and then, as the day is winding down and everyone sits for dinner, Bill's dad, who's a pretty impressive guy himself, decides it's time to get everyone involved. And this is the question he puts to the table. He asks every single person there to name the one thing, the single most important factor that led to their success in life. It's a great question, right? It really tells you a lot about how a person thinks. So the answers go around the table until it's time for the two stars of the show to answer. And there it is. This one word explains everything. Both Bill and Warren gave the exact same answer: focus. In that one word, this total odd couple, the tech nerd from Seattle and the old school investor from Omaha, realized they were running on the same operating system. Their worlds, maybe they weren't so different after all. So that day, that was the spark. It was the beginning of this incredibly deep friendship. And it grew from just having a similar mindset into this powerful two-way street of influence that would actually start to change them both in some really profound ways. And what's so important to get here is that this wasn't just Warren mentoring Bill. Not at all. Warren, who was a master of public relations and somehow managed to be a beloved billionaire, he helped Bill deal with his reputation as a corporate bad guy. He told him about his circle of competence idea, only playing the games you really truly understand. But in return, Bill was constantly on Warren's case to get a computer, to start thinking about the world in terms of data and systems that can scale up, an idea that would become so important later on. And you know where their bond was really forged? Over the card table. They both loved the game of bridge, and it just became this perfect metaphor for their whole relationship. They were this legendary pair, famous for being able to play almost in silence, just reading each other's signals and knowing exactly what the other was thinking. This was way more than just a game for them. It was how they connected on an intellectual level. Okay, so when it came to the idea of giving all their money away, they were on completely different planets. For decades, Warren Buffett's plan was super simple, and it was based on the one thing he understood better than anyone: compound interest. He truly believed the best thing he could do for the world was to wait. I mean, his logic from a certain point of view is hard to argue with, right? Why give away $1 billion today when, thanks to the magic of compounding, you could let it grow into 10 billion or 20 billion, and then give that away when you're gone? For him, giving money away too early was just bad math. The whole point was to make the biggest gift possible for humanity. But then Bill and Melinda had an experience that completely turned that cold, hard logic on its head. They took a trip to Africa, and they saw firsthand the devastating reality of extreme poverty and disease. We're talking about children dying from illnesses that had been wiped out in places like the US for decades. For them, this wasn't a number on a spreadsheet you could maximize over time. It was a real human crisis that needed action right now. So you've got this tension, this philosophical clash between give it all away later and give now. And that tension set the stage for what is, without a doubt, one of the most incredible moments in the entire history of philanthropy, a moment that would fuse their two very different ideas into one single, unstoppable force. You're not going to believe how this went down. It is almost absurd how casual it was. They're at Warren's house in Omaha. They're eating McDonald's and drinking cherry Coke, playing a game of bridge. And Warren just drops it into the conversation. He just announces that he plans to give the majority of his massive fortune, not to his own foundation, but directly to Bill and Melinda's. They were both so stunned, they just started crying. Let's just let that sink in for a second. This wasn't just a big donation. It was, and it still is, the single largest charitable gift in all of human history. It literally doubled the size of the Gates Foundation overnight. Just poof! It created the biggest philanthropic organization the world has ever seen. So why did he do it? This quote from him really nails it. He saw that Bill and Melinda were young, they were brilliant, and they had already proven they could tackle huge global problems with this business-like, data-driven system. He trusted them. He trusted his bridge partners to be the best possible managers for the fortune he'd spent his entire life building. But, and this is a big but, an incredible act of generosity like this doesn't just happen in a bubble. It forces us to ask some really tough, really complicated questions about wealth and power and what philanthropy even means in the 21st century. This is a quote from the original mega philanthropist, Andrew Carnegie, and it's a quote that Buffett himself would have his rich friends debate. It's this idea that if you make a giant fortune, you have a moral duty to give it away for the good of everyone. But how you do that, and where that money even came from, well, that's at the very center of the debate today. And this number, it just puts the whole thing in perspective. A 2017 report from Oxfam found that just 8 men, you can count them on 2 hands, had as much wealth as the poorest half of the entire world's population. That's about 3.6 billion people. This is the staggering level of inequality that we're talking about here. So this has sparked a really fierce debate. Is this kind of philanthropy an amazing force for good? Or, as some critics say, is it a type of amnesty that lets billionaires wash their hands and clean up their legacies? I mean, it raises these huge questions. Does this system give a tiny, unelected group of super rich people way too much power to decide what happens in global health and education? And is it right that these massive fortunes, which are untaxed, get directed by private foundations with basically zero public accountability? And that brings us right back to their favorite game, bridge. See, in bridge, after the bidding is done, one player becomes the declarer. That person calls all the shots. They decide the strategy, and they play both their own hand and their partner's. Their partner becomes the dummy. They just have to lay their cards down on the table for everyone to see, and they get no say in how the rest of the game is played. And so that's the final question we're left with, isn't it? In this huge, high-stakes game of global philanthropy, where billionaires are setting the strategy and making the calls, who gets to be the declarer? Who gets to decide the fate of billions of people? And who, at the end of the day, is the dummy, their fate laid bare, with no say at all in the game being played for their own good? It's a question that really gets to the heart of both the incredible power and the potential danger of modern philanthropy.
Picture this. It's July 5th, 1991. The holiday weekend is just wrapping up. And in a helicopter buzzing over Puget Sound, Bill Gates, the second richest man in America, is, well, he's annoyed. At the same time, Warren Buffett, number 8 on that same list, is driving to the same place, feeling pretty much the exact same way. You see, these two titans of industry are about to meet for the very first time. And the crazy part, neither of them wants to be there.
Okay, so let's really dive into this, because the tension before this legendary friendship even began is just... it's fascinating. This was not some eager meeting of the minds. No, this felt more like an obligation, and believe me, both of them were already plotting their escape.
I mean, you can practically hear the groan in that quote, right? As Warren Buffett was being driven to the Gates family vacation home, this is literally what he was complaining about to the person he was with. He was just imagining a full day of forced, boring small talk and wanted to figure out the absolute minimum amount of time he had to stay before he could bolt. And get this, the feeling was completely mutual. Bill Gates had already told his mom that Buffett was, just a stock picker. He said the guy just shuffles pieces of paper around and doesn't actually create anything valuable like he does. Bill even told his pilot, "I'm staying for 2 hours max." So here you have two of the sharpest minds on the entire planet, and they had both completely misjudged each other.
So who on earth was behind this forced summit? Well, it was a group of very powerful, very well-intentioned women. You had Bill's mother, Mary Gates, and Warren's very close friend, the legendary publisher of the Washington Post, Kay Graham. They kind of cooked up this whole scheme. And they knew it was a total gamble. They even admitted it was more than likely they'd bore each other, but they decided to go for it anyway.
All right, so the stage is set. You've got two skeptical billionaires stuck in a social event they want no part of, both basically staring at their watches. Now, let's get to the exact moment, the pivotal moment, where everything changed. And that's it. That's the question. No, how's the weather? No small talk about the flight. Warren Buffett just walks right up to Bill Gates and cuts straight to the core of what makes him tick. He asks this incredibly deep, strategic question about Microsoft's biggest rival, the giant they called Big Blue. And you can just imagine the shift. Bill's annoyance just melts away. This wasn't small talk. This was a real, meaty, analytical problem. This was his language. Suddenly, Warren wasn't just another guest his mom made him meet. He was someone who actually wanted to understand the fundamentals, the very bones of Bill's business. And from there, the floodgates just opened. They started talking about how this tiny company, Microsoft, was taking on a behemoth like IBM. Warren was digging into the nitty-gritty of software pricing and the kinds of skill sets Bill needed. Bill got so comfortable that he actually started giving Warren advice, telling him to sell off some of his big stocks. And Warren's reply was so simple. He basically said he got to where he was by ignoring that exact advice. And in that moment, Bill Gates realized something huge. He'd finally met someone who had the intellectual weight to actually genuinely push back on his ideas. So, remember that 2-hour escape plan? Yeah, about that. Bill called up his pilot and completely canceled the return trip. He ended up staying the entire day, just talking and walking with Warren, pretty much ignoring every single other high-powered guest his parents had invited. The connection was that fast and that deep. But why? Why did these two click so intensely, so quickly? Well, to really get that, we need to rewind the clock a bit. Because it turns out, long before they ever shook hands, their minds were forged in these remarkably similar fires, shaped by early obsessions and some pretty serious personal crises. Let's start with Warren Buffett. From his earliest days, this kid was obsessed with numbers, with odds, with systems. I mean, at 6 years old, he wasn't just playing marbles, he was timing their races with a stopwatch and recording all the data. By 11, he was already buying stock, and by 14, he was dealing with the IRS. For him, the world was just this giant set of numbers that needed to be understood and optimized. But his childhood wasn't just about fun with numbers. It was also shaped by a ton of emotional chaos. His mother, Layla, was apparently brilliant, but suffered from these terrifying mood swings. They were described as great verbal thunderclaps that would just erupt and shake whichever kid happened to be closest. So, what do you do when your home life feels completely unpredictable? For Warren, the world of numbers and financial ledgers became his safe space. Making money wasn't just a game. It was something he could actually count on. It was predictable. It was something he could control when everything else felt totally out of his control. And the one concept that truly set his world on fire was compounding. After reading this book called 1,000 Ways to Make $1,000, he discovered this magic. The idea that it wasn't just about earning money. It was about making money from the money you already had. This became the central guiding principle for his entire life. Okay, so now let's pivot over to Bill Gates, and what you'll see is this incredible parallel story. His obsession wasn't with ledgers, it was with the pure logic and precision of code. At just 13, his school got one of the very first computer terminals, and he just dove in. He mastered the basic programming language, started creating games, and tackled ridiculously complex problems, like creating his school's entire class scheduling system from scratch. And just like Warren, Bill's formative years were also hit by a profound and sudden trauma. His best friend and his main programming partner, a kid named Kent Evans, the guy he was working side by side with on that incredibly complex scheduling program, died tragically in a mountaineering accident. So how did he deal with it? Well, the source material says he was absolutely crushed. He couldn't do anything at all for 2 solid weeks. But then, Just like Warren retreated into the clean logic of ledgers, Bill retreated into the clean logic of code. He poured every ounce of his energy back into the very projects he'd shared with Kent, and he called on Paul Allen to help him finish them. It was right there, in the middle of processing this horrible tragedy, that the partnership that would become Microsoft was truly born.
Okay, so you've got these two incredible minds, shaped in parallel by intense obsession and personal trauma. Both found their purpose and their refuge in logical systems. Now let's jump back to that dinner party in 1991, because this is where that shared history all comes together in one single perfect moment.
So the scene is set. Everyone's at dinner, and Bill Gates Sr., a super successful lawyer himself, poses this amazing question to the whole table. He asks, "What is it? What's the one single thing, the most important factor that got you to where you are today?" And this is it. This is the core of their connection. Separately, without even talking to each other, both Bill Gates and Warren Buffett gave the exact same one-word answer: focus. In that single word, they recognized this deep, fundamental, shared truth about how they saw the world and how they operated in it. It's incredible. And that shared understanding, that deep mutual respect for intense, unwavering focus, that became the absolute bedrock for one of the most important and honestly unlikely friendships in modern history. And the connection didn't just end when the party was over. One of the very first things Bill did when he got back home was reach out and ask Warren for a book recommendation. And Warren didn't just email him a title, he mailed Bill his own personal, out-of-print copy of his all-time favorite business book, Business Adventures. Their friendship was really cemented right there, over a shared love of learning.
Warren made a little gesture of his own, too. He went out and bought 100 shares of Microsoft. Now, for a guy like Buffett, that's the financial equivalent of finding loose change in your couch. It was never about the money. He said it was his way of carving out mental space for Bill. It was a symbolic investment, not in the company, but in his new friend and his vision for the future.
And all of this leaves us with one last big thought. From a meeting that neither of these men even wanted to attend, this incredible bond was formed, all over a single shared value. It really makes you wonder, doesn't it? What happens? What becomes possible when two people who have absolutely mastered the art of focus finally turn that immense combined power toward the same problems? All right, let's dive into the stories of two absolute legends, Warren Buffett and Bill Gates. Now, one of them built this massive empire on pure patience and value, in the crazy world of finance. The other, he built his on blistering speed and innovation, basically creating the digital world we live in. We're talking about titans from completely different universes, but as we're about to see, their paths would eventually cross in a way that changed everything. So on one hand, you've got Warren Buffett, the Oracle of Omaha, a guy who moves slow, steady, and with incredible precision. And on the other hand, you've got Bill Gates, the guy behind Microsoft, a true revolutionary who worked at the speed of light. I mean, their strategies, their personalities, their whole way of doing things, they just couldn't be more different. So, you gotta ask, where did these wildly different ways of thinking come from? Well, to really get who they became, we have to go way back. We have to look at the big ideas that grabbed them when they were young, long before anybody knew their names. Through young Warren Buffett, it all started with a book, The Intelligent Investor by Benjamin Graham. And listen, this wasn't just some book he read. It basically became his Bible. It gave him a system, a logic that just cut through all the noise and chaos of Wall Street. It replaced all the guesswork with cold, hard math. Okay, so here's the absolute key to it all. This idea of intrinsic value. Let's make it simple. Imagine a company called U Corp. All your stuff, your house, your car, your savings, that's your assets, say 200 grand. Then you've got your debts, mortgage, credit cards, that's 100 grand. So your intrinsic value is $100,000. Benjamin Graham's whole game was simple. He would only, and I mean only, buy a piece of U Corp if it was on sale for a massive discount, like 50 cents on the dollar. That was the entire strategy. Now for Bill Gates, totally different story. His big aha moment didn't come from some dense financial book. Nope, it came from the cover of a magazine featuring this thing called the Altair 8800. And it wasn't just a machine, it was a kit you could build yourself. That cover was basically a giant blinking sign that the age of huge room-sized computers was over and the era of the personal computer was about to just explode. For Gates, that was the starting gun. So with these big ideas locked in, let's look at how they actually put them to work in their first real ventures. And the difference is just stunning. Buffett's approach was this slow, careful, step-by-step process. Gates? It was a wild all-or-nothing sprint into a future nobody could even see yet. Buffett's method was pure Graham through and through. He would spend forever researching companies, figuring out what they were really worth. He was looking for what Graham called cigar butts, stocks that other investors had thrown away, but that still had one good puff left in them. He'd buy them for super cheap, creating this margin of safety, and then he'd just wait. Seriously, he was more like an oceanographer mapping the deep sea than a surfer just trying to catch a quick wave.
Gates, on the other hand, was in an absolute dead sprint. The second he saw that magazine, he and Paul Allen basically just moved into the computer lab at Harvard. I'm talking all-night coding sessions, just a total frenzy, writing a programming language for a computer they'd never even touched, on a simulator they had to build themselves, and the pressure was insane. The first team to land in Albuquerque with working code would get the deal. That was it.
And this just perfectly captures the tension of that moment. So Paul Allen gets on a plane to New Mexico holding this precious punch tape with all their code. He gets there, and for the very first time, he loads it into a real Altair computer. The room is just filled with doubt. He types print 2 + 2. The machine starts clattering away, and then it prints 4. That simple little number wasn't just math. It was the birth of the entire personal software industry. Just incredible.
Now, these totally opposite ways of working weren't just for business. They were deeply, deeply rooted in their personal lives, too. During these really crucial formative years, one of them was carefully building a support system, while the other was basically just trying to survive in a pretty hostile world. It's really a fascinating contrast, isn't it? While Warren Buffett is over here charming his future father-in-law by playing the ukulele, a young Bill Gates is at Harvard getting a reputation for being, well, obnoxious. He was socially awkward, a really intense poker player who lost a ton of money, and was generally just struggling to figure out where he fit in. You see, at the absolute center of Buffett's world was his wife, Susie. She gave him this unconditional love and emotional foundation that let him just totally lose himself in his work. I mean, she cut his hair, she helped him deal with people. She famously said he was the flower and she was the watering can. She built the whole support structure that let him go out and build his empire. Gates, meanwhile, he was learning some really tough lessons about survival. For the first time in his life, he got to Harvard and realized, wait a minute, I'm not the smartest guy in the room anymore. His first company, something called Trafodata, was a total bust. His real lifeline was his loud, energetic friend Steve Ballmer, who would drag him out to parties. And in the end, Gates's gut told him the real action wasn't in some classroom. It was in the revolution that he could see coming. So he dropped out. So years and years go by. Both of these guys achieve just mind-boggling success, each on their own separate tracks. And then, finally, they meet. And Gates, the man who built an entire empire on speed and efficiency, was about to learn a lesson that would change his life. From the man who built his on patience. You have to understand Bill Gates at this point in his life. His calendar was like a weapon. Every single minute was scheduled. It was just a relentless grind of meetings and tasks. And for him, that packed schedule was proof that he was serious, that he was productive. He thought that was the only way you could operate at that level. So here's where it gets really interesting. Gates, the master of the packed schedule, gets curious. He asks to see the day planner of Warren Buffett, the master investor. He's probably expecting to see something even more insane than his own, a schedule packed with a whirlwind of activity. And this is what he saw. Nothing. Just nothing. Page after page, week after week, with only a handful of appointments. The calendar was almost completely blank. Now, for a guy like Bill Gates, this was more than just a surprise. It was like it broke his brain a little bit. How can one of the most successful people on the planet have a schedule that was empty?
This whole moment, it wasn't really about calendars. It led to what might be the single most important piece of advice Buffett ever gave Bill Gates, a lesson about the one asset that's more valuable than any stock, any patent, any company on earth. The way Buffett explained it was so simple but so profound. Filling every minute of your day isn't a sign of how serious you are. It's a sign that you've lost control over your most valuable asset. Buffett's empty schedule wasn't because he had nothing to do. It was a deliberate choice to protect time for his most important job, to just sit and think. You have to control your time, because it's the one and only thing that all the money in the world can never, ever buy back.
And that leaves all of us with a really powerful question to think about, right? What Buffett taught Gates is that your schedule isn't just a list of things to do, it's a perfect reflection of your priorities. It's a brutally honest look at what you actually value. So maybe take a look at your own calendar. What story is it telling about you?
Warren Buffett. You hear the name and you immediately think of wealth, of wisdom, and this almost magical ability to just pick winner after winner in the stock market. But the story you usually hear, the folksy, soda-drinking grandpa from Omaha who just buys good companies, that barely even scratches the surface. So today, that's what we're going to do. We're going to deconstruct that legend, move past the simple stuff, and find the real, and honestly far more fascinating, story of how Warren Buffett truly became Warren Buffett. And this whole story really kicks off with a single question. Back in 1998, at the University of Washington, a student gets up and asks Warren Buffett and his good friend Bill Gates a super direct question. How did you two get, and I quote, richer than God? I mean, it's the question everybody wants the answer to, right? But their answers on stage, well, let's just say they were a little too simple. Buffett starts talking about the importance of rationality and forming good habits. Gates credits a lot of it to luck. And look, yeah, sure, those things matter, but they are not the whole story. Not even close. The real answer is this gripping business adventure. It's a story of a brilliant mind that was constantly evolving, facing down these massive crises that would have broken anybody else, and building his entire empire on a code that was completely non-negotiable. All right, so to really get Buffett, you have to go all the way back to the beginning, with this foundational mindset that made him such an outlier from day one. And it wasn't something he learned in a fancy business school. No, this was forged when he was just a kid. Now, this quote wasn't just some line Buffett read in a book one day. No, this was recited to him over and over by his father, Howard. And this one idea that you have to think for yourself, that you have to maintain your independence from the sheer madness of the crowd, that became his armor. It's what protected him from the groupthink and the panic of Wall Street. It is literally the bedrock of everything that came after. And he put this whole independent thinking thing into practice right away. When he started his very first investment partnerships, he just totally rejected the standard Wall Street model, taking a commission on every single trade. Instead, he basically told his investors, who were mostly his friends and family, look, I only make money if you make money above a certain amount. And this is the crucial part. If he lost money, he was personally on the hook for a huge chunk of it. He was betting on himself, tying his own fate completely to his client. So, that independent mindset, it led him straight to his first real strategy, one he picked up directly from his mentor, the guy who basically invented value investing, Benjamin Graham. And let me tell you, Graham had a very specific and pretty colorful way of finding bargains. Graham called it cigar butt investing, and the analogy is perfect. Imagine you're walking down the street and you find a cigar someone threw away, but it's still got one good puff left in it. You pick it up, you take that free puff, and you toss it. That's exactly what Buffett did with stocks. He'd find some beaten down, ugly, totally unloved company that was trading for less than its assets were actually worth. He'd buy it, wait for that one little puff of profit as the market eventually corrected, and then he'd sell. It wasn't glamorous, but for a while, man, it was extremely profitable. But here's the thing. The supply of these free cigar butts was starting to dry up in a booming market. And just as Buffett was getting to be the master of Graham's system, a new voice entered his life, a voice that would challenge him to evolve beyond it. And that voice belonged to Charlie Munger, another absolute genius from Omaha, who is famously described by his own kids as a book with legs. And the story of how they were basically fated to meet? It's just incredible. Before Buffett had ever even met Munger, he was pitching this potential investor, a Dr. Edwin Davis. And after this really strange pitch where Buffett demanded total control over the money, the doctor, who seemed like he was barely even paying attention, suddenly just agrees to invest $100,000. A totally stunned Buffett asks him why, and Dr. Davis just says, well, you remind me of Charlie Munger. Their intellectual connection was so strong, it existed before they even met. Their partnership would literally change the game of investing forever. It was Munger who pushed Buffett to stop picking up these soggy old cigar butts and to start looking for truly great businesses, companies with durable long-term advantages. And this new philosophy, it was about to face the ultimate test. This led to this absolutely crucial idea of the competitive moat. Munger convinced Buffett that it's so much better to buy a wonderful company at a fair price than it is to buy a fair company at a wonderful price. The real key was finding businesses that were protected by a moat, a sustainable advantage that keeps all the competitors out, allowing the company to just thrive for decades. So what does a moat even look like in the real world? Well, think about Gillette. Once you own the razor, you're kind of locked into buying their blades. That's a moat. Or a drug patent, which gives a company a legal monopoly for years. Or think about Walmart's massive scale, which lets them sell cheaper than anyone else can. And this one brilliantly illustrates the power of a brand. Star Wars has a moat built on pure fandom. But maybe the most powerful moat of all is just trust. And that brings us to 1963 and a perfect storm of a crisis. American Express gets completely engulfed in the salad oil scandal. Basically, a client defaulted on huge loans that were secured by tanks of salad oil that, well, they turned out to be mostly seawater. The market freaked out, Amex stock just collapsed. Then, 2 days later, JFK was assassinated, and the whole nation plunged into grief and uncertainty. And at this exact moment, while his own father was lying dying in the hospital, Warren Buffett goes to work. He ignored the panic, he investigated Amex's real business and realized their moat wasn't finance, it was the trust people had in their traveler's checks. He saw people were still using them, so right in the middle of a national crisis and a deep personal tragedy, he made his biggest bet yet. He sank a massive chunk of his partnership's money into American Express. And the results? Just wow. His investment quadrupled in just 3 years. This was the moment. This was the Munger philosophy being proven in the most spectacular way possible. It was a career-defining win, forged in the absolute crucible of chaos. Okay, so the Amex bet gave him the money and, maybe more importantly, the confidence for his next move. And it's maybe his greatest move ever. It involves a failing textile mill, a really stubborn CEO, and an act of pure, unadulterated pique that accidentally created the greatest investment vehicle in history. This is honestly one of the best stories in all of business. Buffett was a stockholder in Berkshire Hathaway, this dying textile company. He had a handshake deal with the CEO, Seabury Stanton, to sell his shares back to the company for $11.50. But when the official offer shows up in the mail, it's for 11 3/8. Stanton was trying to cheat him out of 12.5 cents. Buffett was so ticked off, he didn't sell. He started buying. He bought and bought and bought until he had control of the entire company, just so he could fire Stanton. It was a completely emotional, totally irrational move. And then he's stuck with this awful business. So what does he do? Well, this is where the genius kicks in. First, he stops pouring any more money into the failing textile business. Second, he takes the cash that the business was still generating and he buys what he called a pinball machine, a small, profitable insurance company called National Indemnity. This gave him access to the float. You know, the premiums customers pay that the insurance company gets to hold and invest before it has to pay out any claims. He used that float to buy other great businesses, which generated more cash, which he used to buy more businesses. He had turned a dying company into a perpetual motion money machine. All right, fast forward to the 1980s. Berkshire is a behemoth. Buffett is a billionaire icon. But his biggest test, it wasn't about making more money. It was about saving the one thing that was priceless, his reputation. Right when he got tangled up in a massive Wall Street scandal. Buffett makes this huge investment in Salomon Brothers, a legendary Wall Street trading firm. But man, their cultures could not have been more different. Buffett's Omaha ethos was all about long-term value, integrity. Salomon, under its CEO John Gutfreund, was the absolute poster child for 1980s Wall Street excess, a dog-eat-dog culture that was all about short-term bonuses where rules were just, suggestions. It was a train wreck waiting to happen. And Michael Lewis, the author, he just nailed it when he said that by partnering with Gutfreund, Buffett had essentially sold his sterling reputation. He lent his good housekeeping seal of approval to a firm whose values were the complete opposite of his own, and he did it without really understanding the consequences. He'd stepped way outside his circle of competence when it came to judging character. So, in 1991, the inevitable finally happens. A massive scandal erupts when a rogue trader at Salomon gets caught illegally manipulating the market for U.S. Treasury bonds. The whole firm is on the brink of collapse. Federal regulators are threatening to shut it down, which honestly could have triggered a global financial crisis. With the entire system at risk, Buffett is forced to fly to New York and take over as the interim chairman. His mission, as he put it, was pretty simple. He had to make Salomon Brothers boring again. His testimony before Congress, that was the defining moment. He laid out his entire new management philosophy for the firm with this one, single, unforgettable line. And this wasn't just talk. This was the core principle he used to clean house, cooperate with the investigators, and slowly, painstakingly, rebuild the trust that Salomon had completely shattered. He put reputation above everything else. So through all of these wild adventures, from cigar butts to corporate scandals, you start to see a clear set of principles emerge. This is the ultimate elixir of his wisdom. This is the code that guided him through it all. So what are the big takeaways from all this? What's the code? Well, first, treat the market like your moody business partner, who Graham called Mr. Market. Use his crazy mood swings to buy low and his euphoria to sell high, but you never, ever let him tell you what your business is actually worth. Second, stay inside your circle of competence. Know what you know, and maybe more importantly, know what you don't know. Third, understand the magic of compounding. Frugality isn't about being cheap, it's about providing more fuel for that financial engine. And finally, the ultimate lesson from the Salomon crisis. Reputation is your most valuable asset. It takes a lifetime to build, and it can be lost in an instant. And that leaves us with one last question to chew on. Buffett's entire philosophy is built on this idea that reputation is more valuable than money. In our world of fast-moving markets, social media, and short-term thinking, is that principle still a viable strategy for success? Or has it become a noble but maybe outdated relic of a bygone era? That's something to think about.
Today, we're diving into the incredible story of Microsoft's rise to absolute dominance and the historic legal battle that almost brought the entire empire crashing down. It's a story about power, innovation, and a question that, believe me, is more relevant today than ever. Who really gets to write the rules for our future? So let's set the scene. Picture this. It's 1998. The legendary investor Warren Buffett is on stage and he's publicly defending his good friend, Bill Gates. Buffett's trying to do some damage control because at this very moment, Microsoft is in the middle of a full-blown crisis.
You see, while Buffett saw a competitive business genius, the United States government saw something very different. They saw an illegal monopolist. They had just launched an all-out legal assault, accusing Microsoft of using its immense power to systematically crush the competition.
So the big question is, how on earth did we get here? How did Bill Gates, the poster boy for tech innovation, the celebrated prodigy, become public enemy number one in the eyes of the government? Well, to really get it, we have to go way back. In the early days, you couldn't turn on a TV without seeing Bill Gates. He was a total media darling, the genius on the cover of Time magazine. But that public image, well, it was built on a foundation of ruthless ambition that was about to come into the light.
It's kind of wild when you look at it. In just 15 years, the whole narrative completely flips. The boy wonder of 1975 becomes the silicone bully by 1990, his head literally photoshopped onto a muscle man's body for magazine cover. But the signs of this, let's call it aggressive approach, they were there right from the start.
This right here, this was one of the first times the public really heard from Bill Gates, and it was a total shock. You have to remember, the early computer hobbyist scene was all about sharing. It was this open, collaborative community. And here comes Gates, with this letter basically calling them all thieves for copying his software. It showed an instinct that put profits way ahead of community.
This was an absolute masterstroke of strategy. See, when Microsoft made the operating system for the very first IBM PC, they didn't just sell it. No, they insisted on keeping the right to license MS-DOS to other computer companies. Gates knew that people's loyalty would be to the software, not the box it came in. By controlling the OS, he made Microsoft the one thing you absolutely couldn't do without.
And you know what's crazy? Gates himself wasn't exactly hiding his intentions. He talked about the benefits of having one standard operating system, and in a public forum he actually used two words that would come back to haunt him, saying it leads to a natural monopoly. I mean, what an incredibly candid thing to admit.
All right, let's look at how this one strategy built an empire that seemed completely unshakable. With MS-DOS and then later Windows, Microsoft didn't just compete in the market, they were the market. And the results were, well, they were just staggering. By the mid-90s, we're talking 9 out of every 10 personal computers on the entire planet were running Windows. This wasn't just market leadership. This was near total domination.
And they used this OS dominance like a weapon. Companies like WordPerfect and Lotus123, they used to be the kings, but Microsoft systematically crushed them. How? They just bundled their own apps, Word and Excel, into Microsoft Office, which, surprise, surprise, ran best on their own Windows OS. It got so bad that venture capitalists were afraid to fund any new software that Microsoft might just decide to copy.
This joke that was going around Silicon Valley at the time, it just perfectly nails the feeling people had. It wasn't that Microsoft was winning because they were innovating and making better stuff. The feeling was They were just using their monopoly power to rig the game, to set the standards, to plunge any competition into darkness. But just when it seemed like Microsoft's kingdom was completely invincible, something was coming. A new technology that threatened to wash it all away, the internet.
Bill Gates saw the threat immediately, and he did not mess around. A little startup called Netscape had created the world's first popular web browser. And Gates realized, if everyone's main window to the world becomes the browser, then the operating system underneath it, Windows, becomes totally irrelevant. Just a boring, buggy set of device drivers. For Microsoft, this was an existential threat.
So Microsoft declared all-out war. Their strategy was simple and it was brutal, designed in their own executives' words to cut off Netscape's air supply. First, they built their own browser, Internet Explorer. Then they wove its code so deep into Windows that you literally couldn't remove it. And this is a classic antitrust move called tying. Then, they gave it away for free and told PC makers like Compaq that if they even thought about featuring Netscape's browser, there'd be trouble.
The tactics were, well, they weren't subtle. In a now famous meeting, a Netscape executive said the message from Microsoft was crystal clear. Give us the browser market or we will destroy you. This alleged ultimatum would become a central piece of evidence that brought the full power of the government down on them.
And all of this, all these aggressive moves in what became known as the browser wars, they led directly back to the courtroom. This kicked off a legal battle that would define an entire era of technology.
So the government's entire case really boiled down to this one key legal idea: monopoly maintenance. See, the argument wasn't just that Microsoft had a monopoly. It was that they were illegally using that monopoly power to kill any new technology, like the web browser, that threatened to make them obsolete.
And this is the part where it stops being just a tech story and starts being our story. The government's point was that when a company chokes off competition, we, the consumers, are the ones who ultimately lose. We never get to see the amazing, innovative new products that might have existed because they got snuffed out before they ever had a chance.
You have to imagine the pressure here. Bill Gates, a guy who saw himself as a titan of American innovation, was being painted as a public villain. The records describe him just railing against what he called a witch hunt. And at one point during a meeting with his directors, he reportedly broke down in tears, facing the very real possibility of his entire empire being broken apart.
Okay, so why does a corporate battle from the 1990s still feel so incredibly important today? Because the fight over who gets to control the essential platforms of our digital lives, well, it never really ended. It just changed shape.
The parallels to today they're just impossible to miss, right? Microsoft's control of the PC operating system looks a whole lot like today's giants, who control social media, search, and the app stores on our phones. Think about Google's dominance in search, or Apple's walled garden app store. The tactics are eerily similar, dictating the rules, locking in users, and neutralizing rivals, often just by buying them before they get too big.
At the end of the day, the Microsoft trial forced us all to ask, who should hold the keys to the digital kingdom? It was a question about power, about control, and about the very future of innovation. And as we look at the tech landscape today, it's pretty clear that's a question that is more relevant and more critical than ever before.
So today we're going to talk about the incredible power of partnership. We're going to do that by looking at the two women who helped shape the legacies of, well, two of the most famous figures in the world, Warren Buffett and Bill Gates. This is a story that's not just about love. It's about influence, conscience, and what happens when unimaginable fortunes get pointed in a whole new direction. So, picture this. It's 1993. Bill Gates and Melinda French are dating, but honestly, Bill seems way more committed to Microsoft. So in this kind of wild move, Bill diverts their private plane to Omaha, Nebraska. And who's waiting on the tarmac? Warren Buffett. But he's not there to talk business. Nope. He drives them to a jewelry store that he happens to own and drops this absolutely incredible line on Bill, basically orchestrating their engagement right then and there. And you know that 6% yardstick thing? Buffett wasn't just cracking a joke. At the time, Bill Gates' net worth was about $6.2 billion. So Buffett was basically suggesting an engagement ring worth a mind-boggling $372 million. Now, obviously, the ring Bill actually bought was a lot less than that, but it was still so huge that Melinda apparently had to roll the stone to the palm side of her finger just to stop people from staring at it all the time. All right, so here's how we're going to break this all down. We just covered the Oracle surprise engagement plan. Next, we're going to dive into how Susie Buffett basically became Warren's moral compass. Then, we'll look at Melinda Gates' moment of lift for Bill. And finally, we'll pull these two parallel stories together to see what it all means. Okay, first up, Susie Buffett's moral compass and how the Oracle of Omaha really found his. You see, before he became this philanthropic giant we know today, Warren Buffett was, well, a completely different guy. He was a human compounding machine, singularly focused on one thing, making money. It was his first wife, Susie, who would completely rock his world and change his entire perspective. And this slide just lays it all out perfectly. On the left, that's young Warren, a total business prodigy, but completely disconnected from social issues, apolitical, even kind of distant in his personal life. And on the right, that's the man he became, a progressive, a passionate advocate for civil rights, and, one of the greatest philanthropists in history. So what was the catalyst for this massive change? It was Susie. To really get a sense of just how zoned in Warren was, you have to hear the colander story. So one time, Susie was sick in bed and asked him to bring her a pan. Warren goes downstairs, she hears a ton of banging and clanging, he finally comes back up and proudly presents her with a colander. The thing with all the holes. When she points this out, he goes back down, makes even more noise, and comes back with the colander placed triumphantly on top of a cookie sheet. Problem solved. It just perfectly captures his genius-level focus on work and his total helplessness with literally everything else. Susie herself had this incredible way of describing Warren. She said she thought of him as an iceberg. It's such a perfect image, right? It speaks to this emotional distance he had. She could see his brilliance, that was the tip of the iceberg, but she knew that most of his emotional and social self was just completely submerged. And in a lot of ways, her life's work became about helping bring that hidden part of him to the surface. She even had a metaphor for her own role in all this. She saw Warren as this blossoming flower of pure intellect and ambition, and she saw herself as the watering can. It was her job, as she saw it, to nurture all the parts of him that he was neglecting: his empathy, his awareness of the world, his connection to things beyond a balance sheet. And look, Susie didn't just talk about these things, she lived them. She turned their home on Farnham Street into a hub for activism. Now, you have to understand, in 1960s Omaha, this was absolutely revolutionary. Their dinner table had guests like an Auschwitz survivor and the baseball legend Bob Gibson. And get this, Susie even used the Buffett name as a front to help Black families buy homes in all-white segregated neighborhoods. That was a seriously risky and radical thing to do back then. And you can see her influence starting to have a real tangible effect. This timeline basically charts Warren's political awakening. But the real turning point, the big one, came in 1967. That's when Susie dragged him to go hear Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. speak. And after that, everything started to change. He joins boards, starts raising money for Democrats, and even cleverly uses his status to integrate Omaha's exclusive all-white social clubs. And this was the line. This was the exact quote from Dr. King's speech that, as Warren put it, took me right out of my seat. For a man who understood systems, rules, and logic, this was a total revelation. It connected the abstract idea of law to the very real, very brutal consequences of injustice. It basically lit a fire under him that Susie had been carefully, patiently tending for years. Okay, so let's shift gears a bit. Because what's so wild is that a very similar story was playing out with another tech titan. Just as Susie Buffett gave Warren a moral compass, a young woman named Melinda French was about to do the very same thing for the incredibly single-minded founder of Microsoft. And you see, this worldview, this was core to Melinda's identity long before she ever had access to billions. This is a quote from her high school valedictory address. She was already talking about success as a kind of social debt, this idea that if you make it, you owe it to the world to help other people up. This philosophy was just baked into who she was from the very beginning. Which brings us to this really fascinating question that comes up in the source material. In her book, Melinda talks about how she and Bill shared this passion for democratizing computing. But if you look at biographies or even talk to people like Paul Allen, that was never really Bill's main thing. His goal was market domination, pure and simple. So the question becomes, was it Melinda who reframed his entire mission? Was she the one who pushed him to think about what his work actually meant for the world? Now, to really get a handle on her unique influence, it's kind of helpful to look at who came before her. Bill's previous serious girlfriend was Anne Winblad, a brilliant software entrepreneur herself. She was his intellectual match, and she focused on things like, getting him to take a vacation or stop living off of burgers. But Melinda, on the right here, she brought something totally different to the table. She was absolutely a formidable intellect who could beat him at math games, but she was also grounded in that deep philosophy of service we just saw. The whole idea for the Gates Foundation, it really started to take shape during a trip they took to East Africa right before their wedding. It was actually Melinda's first time outside of North America and Europe. And yeah, the safari was incredible, but it was the encounters they had with people living in extreme poverty that just left a permanent mark on her. She described the whole thing with these really powerful words. And all of that led to this one, life-changing walk on a beach in Zanzibar. There, their conversation totally shifted. It went from just observing the poverty to asking these really fundamental questions, like what are these women's lives actually like? What's keeping them trapped? With all the wealth we have, what could we do about it? And the biggest question of all, is it our job to even try? This was the exact moment the idea for their foundation was really born. So they get back home, and Bill does what Bill does best, right? He dives headfirst into the data. And what they uncovered was, in his own words, mind-blowing. They found out that a staggering 11 million children were dying every single year from diseases that were easily and cheaply preventable, things like pneumonia, diarrhea, and malaria. For a problem solver like Bill, seeing a massive, solvable problem that the world was basically ignoring, well, that was the ultimate call to action. All right, let's bring these two stories together. We've got two of the most brilliant business minds of the last century, each completely obsessed with building an empire. And in both cases, their partners came to them and asked them to look beyond that empire and consider a much, much more important question. This table just lays out the parallel perfectly. For Warren, the partner was Susie, and her influence was a social and moral compass. The big turning point? Hearing Dr. King speak, which led to his shift toward progressive activism. For Bill, the partner was Melinda, who brought this humanitarian vision. Their turning point? That trip to Africa, which led directly to the Gates Foundation. I mean, the pattern is just, it's undeniable. I mean, think about it. Both of these men were geniuses at accumulating wealth and power. They were literally building empires. But their partners were the ones who fundamentally challenged them to define the purpose of that empire. They shifted the entire focus from how much can we build to what good can we do with what we've built. And this whole story has this really poignant final chapter. Just before her wedding to Bill, Melinda got a letter from his mom, Mary, who was terminally ill at the time. The letter ended with this powerful charge. It was like a passing of the torch from one generation's social conscience to the next, basically entrusting Melinda with the family's deepest values. 6 months later, Mary Gates passed away, and soon after that, the Gates Foundation was born. And that really leaves us with this final thought, right? We often think of a great partner as someone who supports another person's ambition. But the stories of Susie Buffett and Melinda Gates suggest something way more profound. That maybe the greatest partners don't just support a legacy, they are absolutely instrumental in helping to define what that legacy will ultimately become.
So what happens when two of the richest people in history decide they're going to give away pretty much all of their money? Well, it kicks off a debate that gets right to the heart of wealth, power, and what it means to be responsible. Okay, let's dive into this super complex world of mega philanthropy. We're going to do that by looking at the journey of its two modern giants, Bill Gates and Warren Buffett, and the huge disagreement that shaped how they would try to change the world.
But, before we can really get a handle on how they approach giving away billions, we kind of have to understand their very, very peculiar relationship with spending even a single dollar. And our story starts, believe it or not, with a couple of coupons.
So there's this story from back in 1990 about Bill Gates, who, at the time, was already worth $3 billion. He's in his store, holding up the entire line, just frantically digging through his pockets for a 50-cent coupon for some ice cream. Now, okay, Gates himself has kind of pushed back on this exact story, but it points to a really well-documented reputation for being almost pathologically frugal.
But here's a story that's not in dispute. In 1995, Warren Buffett, a man whose cheapness is absolutely legendary, treats his new friend Bill Gates to lunch. And where does he take him? McDonald's, in Hong Kong. And get this, Buffett paid for it using coupons he had clipped and brought with him all the way from Nebraska. This isn't just some funny little quirk. It's the key to understanding the entire mindset behind the biggest charitable project in human history.
All right, so here's what we're going to cover. We'll start with the central paradox, that early debate between Gates and Buffett. We'll trace its roots back to the gospel of wealth. We'll explore the Ovarian Lottery, which was the epiphany that changed everything.
Then we'll compare two big models of philanthropy, see how they're being used today, and wrap it all up by looking at the complicated legacy of it all.
You know, the whole partnership between these two guys didn't start with an agreement. It started with a friendly, but really profound debate. Before they ever joined forces, Gates and Buffett had two totally opposite views on the single most important question: when? When is the right time to give a massive fortune away?
So in one corner, you had Bill Gates. A trip to Africa showed him the staggering scale of preventable disease, and it just lit a fire under him. He wanted immediate action. And his whole argument, it was just pure logic. It's not about the total number of dollars you give, it's about the number of lives you save. If a dollar today can save a life that might be gone tomorrow, well, then giving today is a moral duty. But then you have Buffett, the master of compounding interest, right? He had this equally logical counterargument. Why give away $1 billion today when you could let it grow and give away $30 billion from the grave? Giving now, he said, actually cuts down the total amount of good you can do in the long run.
Yeah, this whole debate, it wasn't happening in a vacuum. Both of these guys were really influenced by an essay written over a century earlier by another titan of industry, Andrew Carnegie. His text, The Gospel of Wealth, basically became the original playbook for the mega philanthropist.
So Carnegie's big idea was, well, it was kind of radical, but also pretty self-serving. He argued that the super rich don't really own their fortunes. They're just temporary trustees for everybody else. Their sacred duty is to give that wealth away during their lifetime for the public good. You know, building libraries, concert halls, universities. But here's the crucial catch. This philosophy also gives a nice, convenient moral excuse for getting that wealth by any means necessary.
I mean, Carnegie's own words just lay it all out there, crystal clear. He believed the millionaire, with his superior wisdom and skills, was the only one qualified to hand out wealth for the maximum benefit of everyone. He wasn't just helping the community, he was managing its money far better than it could have done for itself. It's basically a defense of rule by the rich, just, wrapped up nicely in the language of public service.
And yeah, critics right away saw the danger in what they started calling anything goes taking. The most infamous example happened just 3 years after he wrote that famous essay. At his steelworks in Homestead, Pennsylvania, workers went on strike to protest huge wage cuts, so his manager brought in armed Pinkerton agents. The battle that followed left 16 people dead. And where was Carnegie? Golfing in a castle in Scotland. And this brings up that central question, right? Does giving money away later wash the blood off the fortune itself?
For years, Warren Buffett was totally in the give later camp, a true believer in compounding his money. But a trip to China in 1995 with Bill and Melinda Gates led to this profound change of heart. And it was all because of this simple but really powerful idea he would later call the Ovarian Lottery. So picture this. Their cruise ship is just floating comfortably down the Yangtze River. Buffett's on the deck, and he's watching these men on the shore physically straining with ropes to pull boats upstream against the current. And right there, in that moment, something just clicked for him. He realized the only thing that really separated him and Bill Gates from those men was pure random luck. The luck of where they were born. The genius could have been right there on that riverbank, but the opportunity wasn't.
So that experience, it turned into this powerful thought experiment that he talks about all the time. Okay, so imagine this. A genie shows up 24 hours before you're born. The genie tells you that you get to design the rules for the world you're about to enter. But, and here's the catch, you have no idea who you're going to be. Rich, poor, smart, not so smart, healthy, sick, born in a war zone or a peaceful country. You're about to pull one single ball out of a barrel with over 7 billion of them. So here's the big question. What kind of world would you design now?
So Buffett's takeaway from all this, it was totally inescapable. He had won the Ovarian Lottery. Big time. He was born a white man in 20th century America, a society that was perfectly set up to reward his unique talent for making money. That moment in China convinced him that just compounding his winnings wasn't enough. He had to start spending them to improve the odds for everyone else who wasn't so lucky. And just like that, the give now debate, it was over.
Okay, so now that Buffett's on board to give away his fortune, the question became how? How do you do it on a scale that's never been seen before? To really get the path the Gates Foundation would take, we need to jump back to that first Gilded Age and look at the two competing models set up by Carnegie and his great rival, John D. Rockefeller.
See, Carnegie's model was all about partnership. He'd fund these one-time projects. Like, he'd give a town the money to build a library, but the town had to promise to pay to keep it running. But Rockefeller, he created something totally new and way, way more powerful. The Perpetual General Purpose Foundation. This was a thing designed to exist forever, using its massive private wealth to shape public policy.
all while being accountable to nobody but a private, hand-picked board. That, not Carnegie's model, became the template for basically every major foundation that followed, including the Gates Foundation.
And at the time, believe me, this idea was super controversial. Critics, including President Teddy Roosevelt, saw it as a direct threat to democracy. They were worried about this unelected, unaccountable, plutocratic institution that could just use private money to force a donor's personal vision on the whole country. A bill that would have put some public oversight on the Rockefeller Foundation was defeated, but just barely. And that set a precedent for private power that we're still dealing with a century later.
But of course, there's a really powerful counterargument here, that at its best, this kind of philanthropy can be a vital kick in the pants for democratic action. Take Carnegie's libraries. They didn't just give people books, they created so much public demand that local governments eventually said, okay, yeah, libraries are a public good we have to provide. And what's even more amazing is the story of Julius Rosenwald, the head of Sears. He funded thousands of schools for black children in the segregated South, a problem governments were actively ignoring. His investment didn't just build schools, it shamed local governments into action and lit a fire for real systemic change.
Okay, so that brings us to today, and to two totally different ways of actually putting these billions to work. And they're perfectly embodied by the very personal style of Warren Buffett's first wife, Susie, and the relentlessly data-driven model of Bill and Melinda Gates.
So on one side, you have Susie Buffett. Her whole approach came right from the meaning of the word philanthropy, loving people. It was personal, it was direct, and it was private. During the AIDS crisis in San Francisco, she famously turned her own apartment into a makeshift hospice, personally caring for her dying friends. Now you contrast that with the Gateses, who were heavily influenced by a philosophy called effective altruism. Their approach was systematic, global, and totally focused on a measurable return on investment. I mean, Bill famously called a vaccine a software patch for your body. And that says it all, right? It's that logical, scalable, engineering mindset applied to human suffering.
So this idea, effective altruism, basically argues that we have a moral duty to do the most good we can possibly do. That means using hard evidence to find the things that save the most lives or create the most good for every dollar spent. It's a really powerful idea. But, and this is a big but, critics point out that it has some pretty big blind spots. It might prioritize simple, easy-to-measure solutions, like handing out bed nuts, over really complex systemic problems like political reform or gender equality, things that don't fit so nicely on a spreadsheet.
All right, so here we are. After all these billions of dollars, after decades of work, what's the legacy of this new gilded age of giving? The debate often gets hung up on whether billionaires should even exist. Maybe a better question to ask is this: is their philanthropy a bug in our democratic system, or is it an essential feature?
So there's this Stanford philosopher, Rob Reich, and he makes a really key point. If a billionaire has three choices for their money, spend it on a new super yacht, invest it to make even more money, or give it away, well then philanthropy is almost always going to look like the best option for society. So the real question isn't whether the giver is a good person or not. It's about the systemic impact of what they're doing on the rest of us.
And that right there brings us to the final, big, unavoidable question. Is this massive private use of money a vital force for good, stepping in where governments fail, like with the Rosenwald schools? Or is it an anti-democratic force at its core, the ultimate legacy of Rockefeller, that allows a tiny, unelected elite to set the public agenda for billions of people? The answer, a lot like the coupon-clipping billionaires who got us here, is incredibly complicated.
Okay, so picture this. It's 1998. The dot-com boom is just exploding, right? Millionaires are being made like every single minute. And right at the center of all this chaos, you've got two of the most powerful guys on the planet. But for them, this is no party. No, this is a full-on crisis. A high-stakes battle for survival that's about to test their famous friendship like never before. So, in one corner, you've got Bill Gates, the undisputed king of tech, right? But his empire, Microsoft, is under a massive assault from the US government, which is literally threatening to tear the whole thing apart. And in the other corner, well, that's his best friend, Warren Buffett, the Oracle of Omaha. He's watching this whole tech mania from a distance, and let's just say he's sounding a very loud, very public alarm bell. So what we have here are two titans, two friends, locked into two totally different wars.
So how does this whole thing shake out? Well, that's what we're going to unpack. We'll kick things off with these two titans living in completely opposite worlds. Then, we're diving deep into Bill Gates' absolutely brutal courtroom fight. After that, we'll switch gears to Warren Buffett and his kind of lonely crusade against all that dot-com madness. We'll see how their friendship, against all odds, got even stronger. And finally, we'll get to the big twist, how this whole crisis led to one of the biggest pivots you've ever seen, the birth of a massive philanthropic empire.
All right, let's go back. The year is 1998. The internet is literally changing everything. And let's be real, Microsoft is the king of this new digital world. But you know what they say, with great power comes a whole lot of scrutiny. And Bill Gates was starting to figure out, the hard way, that he wasn't just on the government's radar. He was becoming public enemy number one. And man, was Bill trying to fix his image. I mean, he was trying everything to seem like a regular guy. He sang Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star on TV with Barbara Walters. For real. He got new suits, new glasses. He was even making fun of his own terrible golf game in commercials. But it just wasn't working. At all. The press made fun of what he wore, and get this, some developer even made a video game called Microshaft Windblows 98. In the game, you had a digital pet called a Billigacci, and you had to keep feeding it money. It was brutal. He wasn't just unpopular, he was turning into a joke. But look, as bad as that PR nightmare was, it was about to get a whole lot worse. The Department of Justice was officially coming for him. The charge? That Microsoft was an illegal monopoly. And you know the crazy part is? No Hollywood screenwriter could have written a worse role for Bill Gates than the one he was about to play for himself. And listen, this was not some slow, dragged-out legal drama. No way. This thing happened at lightning speed. The judge, a guy named Thomas Penfield Jackson, he put the whole case on the fast track. I mean, just look at this timeline. It all starts with Gates's deposition in August of '98. The trial itself kicks off that October, and get this. By May of 2000, not even 2 years later, a judge had ordered his entire company to be broken up. It was an absolute legal blitz. Okay, so the real turning point here, it actually happened before the trial even started. The government's lead attorney, this legendary lawyer named David Boies, sat down with Bill Gates for 3 solid days of questioning, and it was all on videotape. Now, you'd think, hey, this is one of the smartest guys on the planet. He's got this, right? Well, not exactly. It was a total disaster, an absolute train wreck. So in this deposition, which is basically just sworn testimony recorded before a trial, Gates was cagey, he was argumentative, he was just difficult. He literally argued about the meaning of basic words like we and ask. He claimed he couldn't remember his own company's strategy even when they showed him emails that he himself had written. And the best part? At one point, Boies points to an email address on a piece of paper and asked where it came from. Gates' answer? A computer. You can imagine how that went over. That videotape became the government's #1 weapon against him. And really, this just gives you a taste of how bad things got. When they played those deposition tapes in the actual courtroom, the judge laughed out loud. Then, a top VP from Intel, supposedly one of Microsoft's closest allies, gets on the stand and testifies against them. The defense was just flailing, so much so that the judge at one point told them, and I'm quoting here, "When you discover you are riding a dead horse, the best strategy is to dismount." Ouch. Yeah, it was a complete and utter disaster. Okay, so while his best friend is literally fighting for the life of his company, what's Warren Buffett doing? Well, he might as well have been on another planet. The dot-com bubble is getting bigger by the day. It seems like everybody and their cousin is getting rich off tech stocks. And Warren Buffett? He wanted no part of it. None. He was deliberately sitting on the sidelines during the biggest financial party of the decade. And he was not shy about it either. This quote really says it all. He basically thought these new internet companies were impossible to put a price on. I mean, they had no profits, no track record. It was all just pure hype. And as far as he was concerned, anyone who claimed they knew what these companies were worth was just making it up. And in Warren Buffett's world, that's an instant F. So this all comes to a head in 1999 at the Sun Valley Conference. You gotta understand, this thing is super exclusive. It's basically summer camp for billionaires and media titans. And guess who's giving the big keynote speech? Yep, Warren Buffett. So he gets up on stage in a room packed with people who've just made obscene amounts of money on the tech boom. And he tells them, to their faces, that they're all trapped in a dangerous bubble. And he doesn't start with any charts or financial models. No, he starts with a story. A parable. He asked the audience to picture an old oil prospector who passes away and goes up to the pearly gates. But when he gets there, St. Peter has some bad news. There's no room. The special area for oil prospectors is totally full. A classic setup, right? St. Peter feels a little bad, so he tells the guy, look, you can say just 4 words to the guys inside. So the prospector thinks for a second, cups his hands to his mouth, and screams, oil discovered in hell. And just like that, bam, the gate bursts open and every single oil prospector inside comes stampeding out of heaven, heading straight down. St. Peter is just stunned. He looks at the prospector and says, wow, the place is all yours now. But the prospector pauses, and then he says, you know what, on second thought, I think I'll go along with the rest of the boys. There might be some truth to that rumor after all. And you can imagine how that landed in the room. The message was crystal clear. Speculative manias can get so crazy that even the person who starts the rumor starts to believe it himself. So here you have it. These 2 best friends living in 2 completely different worlds of chaos. One is stuck in this legal and public relations nightmare. The other is basically the only sober person at a wild party. And yet, somehow, through all of that pressure, their friendship didn't just hold up, it actually got deeper. So let's think about this. While Bill Gates is being interrogated by lawyers and his entire company is staring down a death sentence from the courts, what was Warren Buffett doing with his days? The difference between their lives at this moment is, well, it's pretty wild. Well, for starters, he was buying Dairy Queen. Yep. He was also buying up tons and tons of silver. And, believe it or not, he was hanging out with Bill. They took this 2-week gold rush trip to Alaska. Apparently, at one point, Warren was trying to close a $1 billion deal on a sat phone, while everyone else was watching grizzly bears. And on a private train Bill rented for them, they played bridge for 12 hours straight. I mean, you couldn't imagine 2 more different daily lives, but that friendship was rock solid. Gates later said that Warren's friendship during that period was a huge gift. And you can tell it was real, right? Down to the little details. Gates used to stock his guest bathroom with University of Nebraska-themed toilet paper just for Warren. But then Buffett did something huge. In this quiet but incredibly meaningful move, the guy who famously hated tech stocks started buying Microsoft stock for Berkshire Hathaway. That, right there, was the ultimate show of faith. You know, this whole trial was a defining moment for Gates. It really forced him to take a hard look in the mirror, at his public image, at his legacy. He was staring at the real possibility of his entire empire being broken into pieces, and he made a choice. He decided he wasn't going to be some fading king. No, he was going to be like his hero, Napoleon, and go find a whole new world to conquer. And he did not ease into it. In 1999, right in the middle of all this chaos, with riots happening in Seattle, the new Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation made an absolutely mind-blowing announcement, a $750 million grant. But here's the key. It wasn't just a check. It was seed money to build a brand new system from the ground up. It was called Gavi, and its whole purpose was to figure out how to get vaccines to the poorest kids in the world. This was classic Bill Gates, the software architect. But now he was designing systems for global health. So what was the final verdict for Microsoft? Well, the order to break up the company, it was eventually thrown out on appeal, but the damage had been done. After years of brutal court fights and being under a microscope, the company was just different. The apex predator of the tech world, as one reporter called them, had been, well, tamed. And this is why a story from the late 90s is so incredibly relevant today. By putting the brakes on Microsoft, the government's lawsuit basically opened up the whole game. All of a sudden, Microsoft was afraid to be the bully on the playground, worried about getting sued again. And that created an opening. Tech journalist Kara Swisher put it perfectly. You can draw a direct line from this one trial to the rise of Google, Amazon, Apple, and later Facebook. The tech landscape we all live in today was forged in the fire of this battle. So in the end, Bill Gates made this incredible pivot. He went from conquering the world of software to trying to save the actual world through philanthropy. He built a second empire, one that you could argue is even more powerful than the first. But it leaves us with this big, complicated question to think about. Can a true force for good be built on the back of what was, for a long time, a ruthless monopoly? Today, we're going to talk about a really pivotal, deeply personal moment in the lives of two of the most powerful figures of our time, Bill Gates and Warren Buffett. And this isn't really a story about business. It's about what happens when just unimaginable success runs headfirst into a profound personal crisis, and how a single song, of all things, ended up reshaping everything. So, to really get this story, you have to start with this one quote from Warren Buffett. It's kind of our North Star for everything we're about to get into. He once called it the ultimate test of a successful life, and it's the lens we need to see his journey and Bill Gates' journey through. The question at the heart of all this isn't about money, it's about love. And as Buffett famously said, the trouble with love is you can't buy it.
So here's how we're going to break it down. We'll start with our two titans, who are on very, very different paths. Then we'll follow Bill Gates' incredible reinvention, see Warren Buffett's whole world come under attack, and then we'll see how a U2 song becomes this unbelievable lifeline before we get to the powerful conclusion about what really matters, love and legacy.
All right, let's rewind the clock to 1998. Now, Bill Gates and Warren Buffett are friends at this point, but in the court of public opinion, oh man, they could not be more different. One was seen as a villain and the other a total hero. And I mean, you really can't overstate how different these two guys were seen back then. You had Gates, the ultra-competitor, this tech monopolist who was in a brutal, ugly fight with the government. Anytime he tried to do charity, people were just deeply suspicious. And then you had Buffett, the beloved Oracle of Omaha. He was this wise sage who seemed totally untouchable, a fortress of good judgment and folksy wisdom. And you can just feel how much this disconnect bothered Gates. He'd read these articles about himself and just think, that's not me. He saw himself as intense, yeah, energetic, for sure, but the media had twisted him into this caricature, this supervillain, and it clearly dehumanized him. He couldn't square the person he knew he was with the monopolist everyone else saw. But right as the world was stepping into a new millennium, this guy, this vilified figure, was about to start one of the most astonishing second acts in modern history. He was pivoting from total software dominance to, well, trying to save the world. And this transformation happened fast. In 2000, he steps down as CEO to focus on his new foundation. Then, just 2 years later, he has this chance meeting with a certain rock star that just supercharges his new mission. And by 2005, the man who was once a public menace is on the cover of Time magazine as a global hero. What a turnaround. The partnership that would literally help reshape global health policy, it almost didn't happen. You can't make this stuff up. When Paul Allen tried to connect them, Bill Gates, whose connection to pop culture was, let's just say, incidental at best, he just brushes it off. He thought they wanted him to meet Sonny Bono. Yes, Sonny from Sonny and Cher. But when they finally did meet in New York, right after 9/11, they didn't talk about music at all. They talked about the AIDS crisis. And Gates was just completely blown away by how much Bono knew, by how committed he was. A really powerful alliance was forged right there and then. As Gates put it, they became partners in crime. So what did this new mission actually look like? Well, a lot of it was guided by Melinda's experiences on the ground in places like Africa and India. The foundation basically took a business approach to these huge global problems. They invested in simple, high-impact tools, stuff that could be scaled up. They used a venture capital mindset, fund a whole lot of promising ideas, knowing that some will fail, but the ones that succeed, well, they'll change everything. Okay, so while Gates is completely reinventing himself, Warren Buffett's world is starting to crumble. That fortress of capital he'd built so carefully, it was about to face this relentless series of attacks from the outside world and from within. Now, Buffett had famously warned everybody about the tech bubble. So when the NASDAQ finally imploded, losing a staggering 78% of its value, you'd think Buffett would be doing a victory lap, right? But it was a cold comfort. His big I told you so moment was really bittersweet because his own company, Berkshire Hathaway, was just taking hit after hit. And it wasn't just one thing. It was a perfect storm. His huge purchase of General Ray was turning into a disaster. Key investments like Coca-Cola were flailing. Then, these ugly rumors about his health sent Berkshire's stock plunging. And then, the ultimate body blow, the sudden tragic death of his closest friend, Katharine Graham, the publisher of the Washington Post. That just utterly rocked him. The pressure was just suffocating. I mean, can you imagine, at the annual meeting in 2000, a shareholder who was frustrated that Berkshire was down while tech stocks had been soaring actually stood up and basically asked him if he'd lost his touch. The Oracle was being openly questioned by his own flock. So in the middle of all this turmoil, Buffett gets more publicly political than he'd ever been. He starts passionately speaking out against a plan to get rid of the estate tax, warning it would create an aristocracy of wealth. He compared it to picking the 2020 Olympic team by just choosing the kids of the 2000 gold medalists. It's a system based on who your parents are, not on merit. To him, it was just absolute folly. But all of these professional battles, all these public fights, they were about to be completely eclipsed by the most terrifying crisis you can imagine, a deeply personal fight for the life of his wife, Susie. The news was just a nightmare. The cancer was advanced, and the treatment was horrific. The surgery was disfiguring, and when she was faced with this grueling course of radiation that only had a 50-50 chance of working, Susie started to wonder if it was even worth it. She actually told her assistant she'd rather just go to a villa in Italy and die. And for the first time in his life, Warren Buffett, the master of calculating odds and managing risk, was completely and totally helpless. He had always just assumed Susie would outlive him. It was the bedrock of his life plan. The thought of losing her, the thought of her giving up the fight, it shattered him. People said he would just break down at the office, terrified and heartbroken. But then an unlikely ally entered the fight. Susie was a U2 fan. And during her absolute darkest nights, struggling with the pain and the doubt, she found solace in a single song. She would play it over and over and over again. It was this nightly ritual just to help her find some peace. That was the song, All I Want Is You, a melody from Bono, the very same man her husband had recently met. And somehow that music helped shift her perspective. It helped her find the strength to keep going. She stopped talking about giving up, and she agreed to do the radiation. She chose to fight. So as Susie began her brutal radiation treatment, the parallel paths of Bill Gates and Warren Buffett were coming together, converging on that same fundamental question. What is a life truly for? What is the ultimate legacy that you leave behind? In July of 2004, Microsoft issued this massive one-time dividend. Bill Gates' personal share was over $3 billion. And without a moment of hesitation, he pledged the entire amount, every single cent, to the Gates Foundation to fight disease and poverty around the world. A fortune dedicated to life. And then, tragedy. Just 1 month after that pledge, while traveling with Warren, Susie said she felt something funny in her head and collapsed. It was a massive brain hemorrhage. She never regained consciousness. The woman who had fought so incredibly hard and chosen to live was gone. And this brings us right back to where we started. This extraordinary, painful period forced two of the world's richest men to confront this very question. For Gates, it led to this historic pledge to use his fortune to save lives. And for Buffett, it was a devastating loss that just underscored the one truth he already knew, that the only thing that truly matters, the one thing you absolutely can't buy, is having the people you want to have love you actually love you. Welcome to The Explainer. We've got a wild story for you today, one that connects two of the richest men on the planet, a really catastrophic failure, and honestly one of the most shocking decisions in the history of giving money away. You know, for Warren Buffett, the original plan was just simple, beautifully simple. For decades, the strategy was perfectly clear. He'd spend his life making a ridiculous amount of money, and then, after he was gone, his wife, Susie, who was really his moral compass, would take on the massive job of giving every last cent away to try and change the world. But then, July 2004 happens, and that perfect plan, it just shatters. Susie Buffett passed away. And with her went the entire blueprint for Warren's legacy. Suddenly, one of the most careful planners in the world was facing a future he had never, ever prepared for. So the next 2 years were just this whirlwind of change for him. While he was grieving, Warren invited his friend, Bill Gates, to take Susie's empty seat on the Berkshire board. This move brought his brilliant bridge partner right into the heart of his business empire. He went to Gates's huge 50th birthday bash on a yacht in Tahiti, and then, in a move that is so perfectly Buffett, he married his longtime partner, Astrid Menks, in a simple backyard wedding, followed by dinner at a bonefish grill. His personal life was being put back together, but that one massive question still hung in the air. So you've got this massive Susie-shaped hole in his plan, a multi-billion-dollar vacuum, really. Sure, his kids had their own foundations, but those were kind of like starter kits, practice money. Could they seriously handle the insane scale of what was coming? Or Was there someone else out there? Someone with the right setup, the energy, and a track record? Okay, so while Warren is wrestling with this deeply personal problem, his friend Bill Gates is doing something very, very public. He'd found his next big project, fixing America's public schools, and he was going to attack it with the exact same intensity he used to build Microsoft. And look, Gates wasn't just saying, hey, let's throw more money at schools or let's hire better teachers. No, his claim was much bigger, much more disruptive. In a huge speech in 2005, he basically said the entire model, the very DNA of the American high school, was broken, a relic from a different era that just didn't work anymore. And of course, his solution felt like it was pulled right out of a Silicon Valley startup meeting. It was all built on three main ideas. First, believe every student can succeed. Second, track everything with relentless data and metrics. And third, be aggressive. Go in and fix or completely replace what's not working. And one of the key tools for this whole intervention, the charter school. These schools were a way to experiment, outside the lines of the traditional system. They got public funding, but they had a lot more freedom with their curriculum, their teaching methods, and who they hired, which often meant non-union teachers. So with this strategy in hand, the Gates Foundation didn't just, test the waters. They opened up a fire hose of cash. We're talking a staggering $51 million to New York City alone to start dozens of new small high schools. Chicago got $20 million, Milwaukee got $17 million. This was philanthropy on a scale we'd never really seen before. So the big question is, how did this super ambitious, data-driven plan actually hold up in the real world? In a messy, complicated American classroom? Well, what happened next? Nobody saw coming. Least of all, the Gates Foundation. Let's take a look. Right in their own backyard, basically, near Seattle, they took a big high school and broke it up into 5 small, themed mini schools, all on the same campus. The idea was that being smaller would create a closer community, better relationships between students and teachers. And you know what? At first, it kind of seemed like it was working. But oh boy, did it create a ton of problems nobody thought about. The schools started fighting each other for students and resources. A kid focused on art in the innovation school couldn't go down the hall to take an advanced science class in the Renaissance school. Even worse, this weird new social ladder appeared. Students started labeling the other schools, saying things like, that one's for the preppy white kids, and that one's for the Asian gangster druggy kids. It got so bad that by the end of the very first year, almost a quarter of the teachers just quit. And if you think that was bad, the situation in Denver, it was even crazier. They took a historic school, Manual High, and split it into 3. It was logistical chaos. You had 3 different principals arguing over who got a new box of textbooks. One principal got so frustrated waiting for a new science lab to be built that she literally started trying to hang the drywall herself. But all this chaos with textbooks and drywall, it was really just hiding a much, much deeper problem. And years later, when researchers crunched the numbers, they found something absolutely devastating for the students who were there when all this went down. Just look at the numbers. Before this whole thing started, Manual High's graduation rate was 68%. Not great, but it's a number. But for the kids who were juniors right when all these changes happened, only 52% of them ended up graduating. I mean, the experiment didn't just fail to help. The data suggest it coincided with the total disaster for hundreds of students. Which brings us to the billion-dollar question. How could they get it so wrong? An organization that's all about data, that has all these experts, could they have just completely misread the statistics? And this, right here, is the absolute heart of the problem. It turns out it's a classic statistical trap. When statisticians looked again, they saw that, small schools showed up a lot among the best performing schools. But, and this is the key, they also showed up a lot among the worst performing schools. It's a small sample size thing. In a little school, a few amazing or a few struggling students can totally throw off the average and make the school look like a huge success or a huge failure. The entire strategy was built on seeing only half the picture. You see, this whole thing wasn't just a simple mistake in strategy. It ripped open these huge, really uncomfortable questions about what modern philanthropy even is, and, frankly, what role billionaires should have in a democracy. So people started asking some really tough ethical questions.
Like Bill Gates called this RMD, research and development for the public good. But when you're experimenting on actual kids in actual public schools, are you basically just turning them into lab rats?
And that just opens up an even bigger can of worms. I mean, who elected Bill Gates, or any other billionaire for that matter, to decide the future of America's education system? In a democracy, we're supposed to have elected officials, people who are accountable to us, making these big policy decisions, not private citizens with giant bank accounts, no matter how good their intentions are.
And that right there, that's the core problem. If a government program messes up this badly, people get voted out. There are consequences. But when a private foundation's big idea fails, even if it ends up hurting thousands of students, who holds them accountable? What happens then? This is the huge risk when philanthropists with big money start meddling in public systems.
Okay, so let's bring it all back. Because while this entire education experiment was basically going up in flames, Warren Buffett was watching. He was listening. And he was getting ready to make the biggest financial decision of his entire life.
And then, in 2009, Bill Gates did something pretty incredible. In his annual letter for everyone to see, he admitted they messed up. He wrote that the strategy just hadn't worked the way they'd hoped, and that the foundation was changing its approach. He didn't try to hide from the data. He faced it, right out in the open.
So just try to picture Warren Buffett in this moment. He's seen the grand plan. He's seen the terrible results from places like Manual High. He's heard all the criticism about billionaires playing with our public systems. And he has also seen his friend publicly own a $1 billion mistake. With all of that swirling around, he sits down at the computer that Bill Gates finally convinced him to buy, and he has to decide the fate of his life's work.
And he types in two names, Bill and Melinda Gates. Yeah. In what has to be one of the most counterintuitive moves imaginable, he chose to give his legacy to the exact people who were behind one of the most spectacular philanthropic failures of the time. The question is just why? Maybe he saw something more valuable than just success. Maybe he saw the incredibly rare ability to admit you were wrong, learn from it, and keep going. And for a guy like Warren Buffett, maybe that was the most valuable asset in the entire world. Today, we're going to unpack the single biggest act of generosity in history. But, this isn't just a story about a massive pile of money. It's a story about a quiet promise made over a game of cards and a really profound disagreement that gets at a fundamental question: what's actually the right way to change the world? Is it with a huge top-down global plan? Or is it with the kind of knowledge you can only get by, being on the ground?
So our story starts in what has to be the most unlikely place for a multi-billion-dollar deal. I mean, forget about Wall Street boardrooms. I want you to picture a quiet Wednesday night in Omaha in Warren Buffett's kitchen with just the sound of playing cards being shuffled in the background. The scene is so casual, it's almost comical. You've got cherry Coke on the table, McDonald's hamburgers served on fancy china plates, and right there, in the middle of this totally normal bridge game, Warren Buffett just quietly drops the news that he's going to give Bill and Melinda the bulk of his fortune. And as they're just staring at him, completely speechless, he just sips his Coke and says, "Astrid, your turn." At first, they were sure they'd misheard him. But then, as the reality started to sink in, Melinda's first thought wasn't about all those zeros. It was about the weight of it all. This quote just captures that feeling perfectly. The very first thing she felt was the staggering responsibility of giving away someone else's entire life's work. In that moment, the card game just stopped, and both she and Bill just started to cry. And this was the number, $37 billion. At the time, that was 85% of Buffett's entire stake in Berkshire Hathaway, the single biggest act of generosity in history. And it came with one really important rule. The money had to be spent as it was given. He didn't want to create another one of those forever foundations. He wanted this money put to work, right now. But, okay, this raises a huge question, right? Why would the world's greatest investor just give his fortune away for other people to manage? Why not build his own foundation, the Buffett Foundation? Well, the answer reveals the core principle that really guided his entire career. Buffett explained it with this super simple analogy. If you need to win a golf tournament, you get Tiger Woods. It's not complicated. He believed in one thing above all else. Find the absolute best person for the job, and then get out of their way. And when it came to changing the world with philanthropy, he decided the best in the business were Bill and Melinda Gates. So he wasn't just giving a gift, he was hiring the best managers for what he saw as the most important job of all.
And to really, truly understand this philosophy in action, we have to talk about the person Buffett maybe admired more than anyone else, Rose Blumkin.
the legendary founder of the Nebraska Furniture Mart. Her story is the perfect illustration of exactly what Buffett looks for.
Just take a second and look at this journey. This isn't just a career path. It's a testament to pure, unbelievable grit. Fleeing persecution, showing up in America unable to speak a word of English, and then turning a tiny $500 loan into a furniture empire. Buffett didn't just see a successful business owner. He saw an absolute force of nature, who, even in her 90s, was still zipping around her showroom in a golf cart, personally closing deals.
And right here, you can see Buffett's model in action. He knew he couldn't run the furniture mart better than Mrs. B could. No way. So he bought what she called her oil well and just let her keep drilling. Find a genius, invest in them, and then trust them completely. Decades later, he applied that exact same logic to Bill and Melinda Gates. Okay, so the money's been delegated, the philosophy behind it is clear, but this is where the problem gets infinitely more complex. Because handing off a fortune is one thing. Trying to use it to solve humanity's biggest, thorniest problems, well, that's where good intentions can go horribly wrong. You know, history is just a graveyard of well-meaning projects that have backfired in spectacular ways. It proves that old saying again and again: the road to hell is often paved with the best of intentions. This story is so bizarre, but it's totally true. It shows how a simple, well-intentioned solution can set off this cascade of new, totally unforeseen problems. So they solved the mosquito problem, sure, but in doing that, they accidentally killed all the cats, which then unleashed a massive rat problem, which then required airlifting in new cats. It's a perfect, almost comical example of what happens when you meddle with a complex system. And on a much, much bigger scale, you have the first Green Revolution. As you can see here, it was what one writer called a poisoned chalice. The triumph? Well, it's credited with saving over 1 billion people from starvation. Amazing. But the tragedy? It also led to poisoned water supplies and trapped countless poor farmers in these endless cycles of debt. It was a miracle and a catastrophe, all at the same time. So armed with all these cautionary tales, the Gates Foundation, now powered by Buffett's incredible gift, supported an effort to bring a green revolution to the one continent the first one had largely missed, Africa. So launched by the Gates and Rockefeller Foundations, AGRA's goal was incredibly ambitious: transform African agriculture. They wanted to use high-yield seeds, modern fertilizers, and industrial techniques, all supposedly tailored to the continent's diverse landscape. They promised this wouldn't just be a one-size-fits-all repeat of the past. But right away, this sparked a really fierce debate that boils down to one fundamental question: what is the actual problem you're trying to solve here? AGRA, they argued it was a production problem, a yield problem. But critics came back and said, no, the problem is poverty. Increasing yield doesn't matter one bit if people still can't afford to buy the food. And this is where the story gets even more fascinating. Because this debate wasn't just between a foundation and its critics outside the building, it was a philosophical clash that was happening within the Buffett family itself. So on one side, you have the approach championed by Gates and AGRA. You can think of it as this massive, systematic, data-driven engine that's designed to find technological solutions and then scale them up across an entire continent. That right there is the essence of philanthropic capitalism. And on the other side is Warren's own son, Howard Buffett. Now, Howie is a farmer himself, and he champions a completely different view, this deep, hyper-local understanding. He believes you simply cannot create solutions that work from thousands of miles away. And Howie has the perfect story to illustrate his point. He discovered that in parts of Malawi, mouse hunters play this key role in the ecosystem. What they do is they clear crop residue off the fields so they can hunt mice, which just happen to be a local delicacy. Well, this directly clashes with aid programs that are trying to get farmers to leave that exact same residue on the ground to improve the soil. And here's the bottom line from Howie. You can have the most brilliant billion-dollar agricultural plan designed in a Seattle skyscraper, but if you don't know about the local mouse hunters, your plan is going to fail. It's such a powerful, almost absurd argument for the absolute necessity of being on the ground. So we have this historic gift, we have these incredibly complex problems, and we have this fundamental clash between top-down, big-picture solutions and ground-up local knowledge. And that brings us right back to our two central figures. How do Buffett and Gates themselves see their partnership in this epic saga? Well, it turns out a Camelot-themed costume party they went to once gives us the perfect metaphor. Bill came dressed as King Arthur. You know, the power, the king of this global philanthropic realm. And Warren? He came as his wizard advisor, Merlin, the wisdom behind the throne, the one who made it all possible. Which leaves us with this one last provocative thought. In a world that is so complex that a village's taste for boiled mice can derail a billion-dollar plan, can the power of a king and the wisdom of a wizard truly be enough? Or does the future of changing the world depend not on a king's decree from a faraway castle, but on actually listening to the mouse hunters in the field? What does that next chapter of giving really need to look like?
All right, let's get right into this. It's a story that kicks off in a secret location somewhere in New York City. You've got some of the richest and most powerful people on the entire planet all gathered for a private dinner. The topic? Philanthropy. But while they're talking, a global catastrophe is just quietly, silently brewing in the background.
So you can imagine, when news of this dinner eventually leaked, people got suspicious, fast. The press called it clandestine, and commentators, like this radio broadcaster, painted this really dark picture. The rest of us were just left wondering, what in the world were they actually planning in that room?
So let's start with that dinner. It happened on May 5th, 2008, at the president's house at Rockefeller University. The whole idea was to get the world's greatest philanthropic minds together to figure out how to solve the world's biggest problems. But, you know, the first problem they had was just trying to keep the whole thing a secret.
I mean, just look at this guest list to get a sense of the sheer concentration of influence we're talking about. It was a total who's who of global power. Buffett, Gates, Rockefellers, Soros, Bloomberg, Turner, Oprah, and one particularly unusual billionaire, a guy named Chuck Feeney.
Yeah, in a room just packed with titans, Chuck Feeney was different. He co-founded Duty Free Shoppers and was on a personal mission to die poor. He was systematically giving away his entire $8 billion fortune. The story of the secret dinner? It actually broke on this small website, irishcentral.com, and well, the common belief is that Feeney's longtime friend who founded the site got the scoop straight from the source.
The whole thing was Warren Buffett's brainchild. He had just made this monumental gift to the Gates Foundation, but he wanted to do more. His idea was to create, basically, an Avengers for philanthropy. He even had a name for it, the Great Givers, which thankfully didn't stick. The goal was simple, though: get more billionaires to give away a lot more of their money.
But here's the thing. While the world's wealthiest people were talking about giving their money away, another one of Buffett's personal crusades was about to just explode into the headlines. A crisis born from a very, very different kind of financial engineering was right around the corner.
Now, to really get what happened next, you got to understand this one word: derivative. Put simply, it's a financial product that gets its value from something else. In this case, that something else was thousands upon thousands of American mortgages. Some were good, but many, many were bad, all bundled up and sold as these super complex investments.
And guess who saw it coming? Warren Buffett. 5 whole years before the crash, he wrote this now famous line in his letter to shareholders. He called these derivatives time bombs, and he warned they could lead to a global run on the banks. And pretty much nobody listened.
So by 2008, Buffett's predictions were coming true in the most apocalyptic way you can imagine. It started with Bear Stearns in March. By September, the dominoes were just falling, one after another, fast. Fannie and Freddie, then the historic collapse of Lehman Brothers. The entire global economy was just staring into the abyss.
And who steps in? Warren Buffett, of course. He played his familiar role as the savior, pumping billions into iconic companies like Goldman Sachs and General Electric, basically to signal his confidence to the market. But his most crucial move? A late-night phone call to the Treasury Secretary, where he pitched the basic idea for the taxpayer-funded bank bailout that, well, it might have saved us from a full-blown depression.
After the dust finally settled, Buffett had this sharp piece of advice. He blamed the whole crash on flawed, history-based models created by financial geeks. These were guys who used these esoteric formulas to convince everybody that home prices could never, ever fall. They just completely ignored that the world had changed, and the result, well, it was catastrophic. Okay, so while all this financial chaos is unfolding, the other key figure from that secret dinner, Bill Gates, he's going through his own monumental transition. On June 27, 2008, he was stepping down from his full-time role at Microsoft. And Gates was leaving a company that, yeah, it was dominant, but it was showing some serious signs of rot. I mean, while Apple was launching the iPod and then the iPhone, Microsoft had the Zune. While Google was swallowing the search market, Microsoft had
MSN search. They even had an e-reader prototype a decade before the Kindle, but they killed it. They were missing every single major new boat.
So what was going wrong? If you talk to former employees, they point to one thing: a brutal employee review system called stack ranking. It basically forced managers to label a certain percentage of their team as top performers, average, and poor. What it created was a culture of internal warfare, where employees were competing against each other instead of against rival companies.
So, with Microsoft in his rearview mirror, Gates turned his full attention and his immense resources to the Gates Foundation. He was ready to apply his intellect to solving the world's biggest problems, but he was about to discover a whole new, really complex set of paradoxes.
The foundation's impact was and still is just undeniable. I mean, think about the number 1.8 million. That's how many zinc tablets the foundation helped distribute in Nepal in a single year to treat children with diarrhea. That effort alone is estimated to save 12,000 lives each year. Just incredible. But a crucial ethical question started to bubble up. See, the foundation has two sides. There's the grant-making side, doing all this incredible charity work, and then there's the endowment side, which invests billions to make more money. So what happens when those two sides are completely at odds?
Well, in 2007, a bombshell investigation by the Los Angeles Times laid this paradox bare for everyone to see. For example, the foundation was funding vaccination drives in Nigeria, while its endowment was invested in the very oil companies accused of causing the pollution and respiratory illnesses the health programs were trying to fix. You see the problem.
And that led to another criticism. The foundation just became so large and so influential in global health that it created what some people started calling an echo chamber. As this quote from a former program leader suggests, few people were willing to risk their funding by pointing out flaws in the foundation's approach, and that of course stifled real dissent and debate. So, let's bring these threads back together. You have the secret dinners, you have the lessons from a financial world in absolute crisis, and you have all the complexities of modern philanthropy. All of this was now converging into one single, really audacious idea. Those brainstorming sessions, led by Buffett and Gates, they kept going, they evolved. That informal idea of an Avengers team for charity, it was formalized into something much, much bigger, something with a powerful name, the Giving Pledge. The core idea was radically simple. They would ask the world's wealthiest people to publicly commit to giving away at least 50% of their net worth, either during their lifetime or when they died. The number, 50%, was, as one reporter put it, pragmatically pulled from the sky. But man, it was a bold challenge. But here's the genius of it. It's how they framed it. Buffett didn't present it as some big sacrifice. With this quote, he performed a kind of psychological jujitsu. He was reframing wealth, suggesting that true wealth isn't hoarding money. It's having so much that giving half of it away costs you nothing. It was a direct challenge to the insecure psychology of the super rich. But this whole thing raised some really complicated questions, which you can see perfectly in figures like the Koch brothers. They were massive philanthropists, donating over $1 billion to amazing causes like cancer research and the arts. Yet they never signed the pledge, and their fortune came from an industry linked to serious public health and environmental problems, including the very carcinogens their charitable donations were fighting. And that leaves us with this final, unresolved question. When wealth is generated in ways that might cause harm to society, and then a piece of that wealth is given back to fix those very same harms, what should we call that? Is it a noble act of giving? Or is it just damage control, the cost of doing business, maybe a form of reputation management? That is the paradox right at the very heart of modern mega-philanthropy.
So, we're diving into a story about a massive public feud between some of the world's most powerful philanthropic forces. But honestly, it's so much more than that. We're talking about a clash of ideas, of family, and a really fundamental disagreement on the right way to spend billions of dollars to change the world. And believe it or not, it was all kicked off by one simple question on national TV. And boom, just like that, with that one little question, everything just burst out into the open. What seemed like, just a bit of family drama actually revealed this incredibly deep ideological divide between two very powerful men. You've got Howie Buffett, the farmer, son of a legendary investor, and then you've got Bill Gates, the tech mogul who was trusted with a huge chunk of that very same fortune. All right, so here's what we're going to break down. First, we'll look at how this private disagreement became such a public fight. Then, we'll get into the two totally competing visions for the future of Africa. From there, we'll see how the critique snowballed into a full-on family affair. And you won't want to miss the quiet parallel revolutions being led by the women in these families. Finally, we'll see how all these personal values collided and ask, can these giants actually find a way to work together? Okay, so this all really starts with Howard Buffett, Warren Buffett's oldest son. Now, Howie isn't some slick CEO in a suit. He's a real no-nonsense farmer. I mean, the kind of guy who has dirt under his fingernails and has spent his life working the land. And get this, in 2011, his dad named him as the next chairman of Berkshire Hathaway, not for his business skills, but to be the guardian of the company's culture, its values of simplicity and just plain old common sense. So on that 60-minute show, Howie did not hold back. He basically argued that the Gates Foundation's whole approach, pushing high-tech seeds and chemical fertilizers, was just trying to force an American system onto Africa. He warned that this model just isn't sustainable, especially for farmers trying to get by on $1 a day. And he was speaking from experience, saying, look, I've seen this movie before, and it's a system that's doomed to fail. And Bill Gates' response? Oh, it was smooth, very diplomatic, but it was also a really clear way of framing the entire debate. He set it up perfectly. He's the farmer, the guy with the hands-on real-world experience, and I'm the city boy, the tech expert who lives by the data. It just perfectly captured the two clashing worldviews right at the heart of this whole thing. And you have to understand, this wasn't just some small disagreement over the best tactics. No. This was a fundamental clash over the core philosophy of how you help the world's poorest people. It was a clash that was really rooted in the completely different life experiences of these two men. This really breaks it down well. On one side, you have Howie's Brown Revolution. Think of it as the farmer's approach. It's all about soil health, sustainability, and building things from the ground up. On the other side, you have the Gates-backed Green Revolution. That's the tech mogul's vision, a top-down, scalable solution that's all about using science and markets to get massive results fast. Now, you got to remember the context here. This whole debate was happening right as the world was going through a massive food crisis. But here's the crazy part. It wasn't just about a lack of food. It was a speculative bubble. Hedge funds started betting on food prices, and suddenly the cost of staples like rice and wheat just went through the roof. This became a real-world test for both ideas and made people ask, is it really wise to push these vulnerable farmers into a global market that's this chaotic? And the criticism of the Gates approach really heated up when people started looking into its deep ties with corporate agribusiness. The foundation was buying millions in Monsanto stock and partnering up with the giant Cargill. They also supported this thing called the New Alliance for Food and Nutrition Security, which critics immediately slammed as a corporate land grab. They argued it was just turning local farmers into laborers on their own land, all for the benefit of foreign companies. And just when you thought this feud couldn't get any more public, the family circle widened. It wasn't just Howie the farmer anymore. His younger brother, Peter Buffett, who's a musician and a philanthropist himself, decided he had to weigh in. And his critique was, if anything, even sharper and more philosophical. In a really famous piece for the New York Times, Peter Buffett dropped this absolutely devastating phrase, conscience laundering. Just think about that for a second. He was describing a kind of charity that, in his view, does more to make rich people feel better about themselves than it does to actually fix the root causes of inequality. Peter's argument was that, way too often, big philanthropy just props up the very systems that create poverty in the first place. He warned against what he called philanthropic colonialism, where wealthy outsiders just show up with their checkbooks and their big ideas, completely ignoring local knowledge. He said this whole approach just helps the rich sleep better at night, while only giving the poor just enough to stop things from boiling over. He was basically calling for a total reboot, a new operating system for how we do good in the world. Okay, so while the Buffett brothers and Bill Gates are having this very public fight over the future of farming, something else is going on in the background, something much quieter. The women in their families, well, they were leading their own revolutions. And their approaches were less about public debate and more focused on the fundamental issues of global health and women's rights. Take Warren's daughter, Susie Buffett. Her strategy was the total opposite of her brother's. Instead of going public, she went dark. We're talking stealth mode. She runs her mother's foundation and has become one of the biggest funders of reproductive rights on the entire planet. But she does it almost completely in secret. Her foundation barely has a website and gives away its money anonymously. It's all about wielding massive influence from the shadows. And if you're wondering if that quiet approach actually works, Oh yeah, the results are undeniable. A program her foundation backed in Colorado led to a 40% drop in the teen birth rate in just 4 years. That is a staggering number, and it's pure data-driven impact, all achieved without a single press conference. At the exact same time, Melinda Gates was having this huge personal awakening. She was on a trip in Malawi talking to a group of mothers about getting vaccines for their children. But then one woman just flipped the conversation on its head. She looked at Melinda and asked, "Where's my shot?" And she wasn't talking about a vaccine for herself. She was asking for birth control. She simply had more kids than she could feed and was desperate for some control over her own body. That moment, and a lot of others like it, pushed Melinda, who's a devout Catholic, to take a very public, very brave stand. At a big summit in London, she became a champion for access to contraceptives. Now, this put her in direct conflict with the Vatican, which is a huge deal. She really struggled with her faith, but in the end, she decided that her moral duty was to empower women and, frankly, to keep them alive. But as Melinda was evolving into this global advocate for women, it also started to expose some pretty deep friction inside her own marriage and inside her partnership at the world's biggest foundation. The personal and the philanthropic were really starting to collide. And a major source of that friction, Bill's relationship with Jeffrey Epstein. Now, Bill had met with Epstein thinking maybe this guy could help him connect with other big donors. His reaction, which we see in this email, was kind of detached. He called Epstein's lifestyle intriguing, even if it wouldn't work for me. Melinda's reaction, on the other hand, could not have been more different. It was night and day. She met Epstein just one time and described it in these chilling terms. She called him evil personified and said she literally had nightmares about it. This wasn't just a small disagreement. It showed a fundamental clash in their judgment and their values. And the same values clash started playing out in their work. Melinda began to push for a truly equal partnership. For example, she wanted to co-author the foundation's big annual letter, which Bill had always written himself. And his initial response was basically, why should things change? As she later said, the argument got hot. It revealed a power dynamic that she just wasn't willing to accept anymore. So, okay, let's just step back for a second. With all of this conflict, we're talking public ideological battles, private clashes over core values, deep philosophical divides. You really have to wonder, is it even possible for these philanthropic giants to work together? So, can they work together? Well, the surprising answer is, yeah, they can. Despite all the public feuding, they've actually found common ground. Bill Gates and Warren Buffett even shared an award for their work on a program helping small farmers. And maybe the most surprising thing of all, the Gates Foundation has even invested millions of dollars directly into Howie's Brown Revolution's soil project. Talk about an odd couple. So in the end, this whole story, it doesn't have a simple hero or a villain. There's no clear winner. Instead, it leaves us with a much more complex and, frankly, more interesting question. When these giants of giving go to war over the very definition of what good is, it forces this huge conversation about power, about values, and about the best way to help people. The real winner isn't one person or one idea. Maybe the winner is the debate itself, this messy, ongoing, deeply human struggle over how to really change the world. All right, today we are diving deep into one of the biggest, most ambitious partnerships in the history of giving. I'm talking, of course, about the massive and, really complicated team-up between Warren Buffett and Bill and Melinda Gates. Yeah, partners. That's the key word here, and it's so central to how Warren Buffett sees everything. But wow, was this partnership going to be tested? I mean, in ways nobody could have seen coming. It really stretched the limits of what philanthropy, accountability, and even personal relationships could handle. Okay, so here's how we're going to break this down. First, we'll look at the pact itself, then their crazy ambitious goal of zero. After that, we'll get into the cracks that started to show up, the big personal crisis that blew everything up, and finally, what this all means for the future of giving. All right, first up, the Billionaires Pact. So, picture this. It's 2016. It's been 10 years since Buffett made his huge pledge to the foundation, and he comes to Bill and Melinda with an idea. He says, hey, you guys should write an annual letter, just like I do for my shareholders. And that one suggestion, it ended up revealing a ton about how they all saw the world. And when you put their letters side by side, it is just fascinating. Buffett's is, sunny and frank. He's talking to a million partners, and it really feels like a conversation. He uses we, he admits when they mess up. It's like a big team huddle. Then you've got the Gates' letter. It's way more polished, full of these slick infographics, and get this, it's addressed to one guy, Warren. It really drives home this massive difference, right? Berkshire Hathaway has shareholders to answer to. The Gates Foundation, it was really only accountable to 3 people. Okay, so that brings us to the core mission. The whole reason for this partnership in the first place. And their goal was so audacious, but also so incredibly simple, you could write it with just one number. 0. That was it. That's the number they put right at the end of their letter. And it wasn't just, a target. It was everything. It was their North Star, the thing they were chasing every single day. And we're not talking about some vague, let's make the world better kind of goal. No, this was laser-focused. 0 malaria, 0 TB, 0 HIV, 0 preventable deaths. The list goes on. The ambition is just, it's breathtaking. They weren't trying to reduce these problems. They were trying to eliminate them, wipe them out, for good. And you might think, wow, that's impossible. But they had a really good reason to believe they could do it. Polio. I mean, the fight against polio had been going on for a while, since '88, but it was kind of stuck. Then, in 2000, the Gates Foundation jumps in with all its money and its focus, its muscle, and suddenly victory was actually in sight. They helped push polio to the brink of extinction, about to be only the 2nd human disease ever to be completely eradicated. So yeah, they had a blueprint for 0. So that brings us to the next chapter, innovation versus politics. Because that huge win with polio, it was a victory for a very specific way of thinking, the tech-first, data-driven, problem-solving approach. But, and this is a big but, that very success started to expose a really deep divide between Bill and Melinda. This wasn't just a small disagreement. It was a clash of entire philosophies about how you actually create change in the world. So on one side, you have Bill. He's always seen this through a technocratic lens. For him, progress is all about innovation. You solve the world's big problems with better tech, right? Better vaccines, better seeds, better data. Politics, that was just messy. It was a distraction from the real work, the measurable work. But that begs a huge question, doesn't it? I mean, can you really separate innovation from politics? Does a new vaccine just exist on its own in a lab? Or does the real world stuff, who gets it, who can afford it, who trusts it, isn't that all deeply political? And this is where you really see that divide in action. You've got Bill, the ledger thinker, running the numbers, looking for the technical fix. And then you have Melinda. She's out there traveling, listening to people, especially women. And she starts to see what she calls the problems inside the problems. Like she said, you can't save kids just with vaccines. Cows are defecating in the stream. You have to see the whole messy picture. And that perspective, it's what led Warren Buffett to say she was smarter in terms of seeing the whole picture. Pretty telling, right? And this whole listening first thing, it led her straight to advocating for women's reproductive rights. She realized that giving women the power to decide if and when to have children was absolutely fundamental. It wasn't a side issue. It was the key to unlocking so much else. And guess who was her biggest cheerleader? Warren Buffett. He apparently told her that her work on contraception was the single most important thing the foundation was doing. So, you have this philosophical fault line, right? And it had been rumbling under the surface for years. Then, in May of 2021, it wasn't a rumble anymore. It was a full-blown earthquake. The news of their divorce didn't just shake up their personal lives, it sent shockwaves through the entire philanthropic world. I mean, the speed of it all was just stunning. Think about it. In a few short weeks, the 3 pillars holding this whole thing up just crumbled. The marriage itself, gone. Warren Buffett's role as a trustee, gone. And the fundamental idea that Bill and Melinda could keep working together, suddenly, that was a huge question mark. And as reporters started digging, the story got a lot more complicated. According to the reports cited in our source, this wasn't just a marriage falling apart. The issues being reported on? Bill's ties to Jeffrey Epstein, which reportedly infuriated Melinda, and other allegations about his conduct, they seem to directly contradict the very work Melinda was championing at the foundation. You can't be pushing for female empowerment on one hand while these kinds of stories are swirling on the other. The tension was just impossible. And all of this personal drama had a massive professional consequence. For the first time ever, the Gates Foundation, which had always been this super private, almost untouchable institution, was suddenly under a microscope. Reporters started poking around in its finances, its operations, and they started finding things, like potential conflicts of interest where the foundation was giving grants to companies that its own investment arm was invested in. It was like the black box of the world's biggest charity was finally cracked wide open for everyone to see inside. So here we are, at the legacy of all this. The original partnership is shattered. Buffett has stepped away. And this leaves this giant, looming question mark over the whole operation. What happens now? And maybe even more important, what did this whole mess teach us about the weird, powerful world of mega philanthropy?
Well, it put one word front and center: accountability. I mean, think about it. When a private foundation gets so big and so powerful that it's basically acting like a small country, who holds it accountable? A company like Berkshire has shareholders. A government has voters. But the Gates Foundation? For the longest time, it really only answered to two people, Bill and Melinda. And this chart just makes it so clear. Look at the numbers. Berkshire Hathaway, about 1 million shareholders get a vote. The US government, 160 million voters. The Gates Foundation, before all this went down, 3 trustees. Just 3 people guiding an organization that affects the lives of hundreds of millions around the globe. It's a staggering contrast. Now, to be fair, the foundation has started to change. They've added new trustees to the board, which is a big deal, and the CEO is now the one writing the annual letters. He even talked about their obligation to be clear about their influence. It's a small step, but it's a step away from a monologue and maybe toward a real dialogue.
But those huge, thorny questions, they're still out there. The questions that Bill was supposedly allergic to. Can you really divorce technology from politics? What happens when your shiny new GMO seed runs up against a local right-to-food movement? These are not easy questions. And the source makes a really important point here. If we don't have a serious, public conversation about these things, that silence creates a vacuum. And you know what fills a vacuum? Conspiracy theories. You know, looking back at it all, this quote from Melinda from way back in 2000, it feels almost prophetic. Just beginning our journey, a long walk we hope is in the right direction. They had no idea just how long and winding that walk would be. And whether it was, in the end, the right direction, well, I guess that's for history to judge. Which brings us to the final, and maybe the most important question of all. And this isn't just about the Gateses or Buffett. In this new era, this new Gilded Age, where a handful of individuals have more wealth and power than many nations, who gets to call the shots? Who decides what the future looks like? Who gets a vote?